The Sunday school lesson for September the 15th, 2024 is Daniel's Friends Trust God. Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 through 28. Welcome, viewers and subscribers to my channel, The Backstory and More. I am Audrey. If you are interested in knowing what happens before each Sunday school lesson, you are at the right place because I will share the backstory, read the lesson text, and offer a brief lesson summary. Thank you so much for all that you do to help this channel grow one viewer and one subscriber at a time. The backstory takes us to Daniel chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Although Nebuchadnezzar was furious at Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he did not act rashly. He invited them in and allowed them to explain themselves. He gave them a second chance. Their response was something like, "There is no need for us to offer a defense of our actions." In short, they refused the second chance they were offered. Note that the king's request was not as drastic as it could have been, since he was not asking these Jews to stop worshiping their own God altogether. He was merely asking them to make a certain addition to their worship practice. Was this not the least they could do to pay him respect? Yet the modern habit of rationalizing questionable practices were nowhere to be found in Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knew that other gods were not to be worshipped alongside the God of Israel. God has no equal, and he will not tolerate being treated as if he does. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35 and verse 39. Any action that grants unquestionable allegiance to a sovereign other than God is idolatry. That's what bowing before the statue would have done. It was one thing to work for the king and show him the basic respect due to those in authority. It was another thing entirely to acknowledge a rival to God. These three Jews expressed faith in God in two ways. One, they acknowledged that God was able to deliver them from both the blazing furnace and the king, who thought he had absolute power. They did not worship a weak God or a distant God who was unable to intervene in events on earth. They worshiped Israel's God, who had proven his ability and who desired to work for the good of those who love him. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9, and Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Secondly, these three men were firm in their worship of God to the point that they refused to bow, whether God chose to intervene or not. God's non-intervention was a strong possibility. In his larger plan, God does not always choose to intervene, as the deaths of Uriah, Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 20 through 23, and James, Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, establish. The backstory ends here, and today's lesson begins with the next slide. Verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 17 times more than it was wont to be heated. Verses 20 through 21. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Verses 22 through 23. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. Verse 25. He answered and said, Lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth, and come hither. Then Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. Verse 27. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trust in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god, except their own God. A brief summary. Sahdrach, Meshach, and Abednego were threatening the unity of the king's empire. If Nebuchadnezzar allowed them to walk free, he would appear weak and indecisive. So the king had to honor his decree and toss them into the fire. Not only that, but he decided to make an example of them by cranking the fire up so high that the men who threw them in died because they got too close. It is interesting to note what kind of religion the Babylon Empire was willing to tolerate. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged Israel's God as the God of gods. Presumably, this meant that it was okay for Jews to worship their God, while others worship Babylonian gods. Nebuchadnezzar appears to have been a tolerant religious pluralist. His subjects could worship whatever and whomever they wished, as long as they remained devout citizens who did what was asked of them. This included adjusting one's religious beliefs when the king deemed it necessary. Worship of any deity who authorized worshipers to deny the king's policy was not acceptable. Our only clue as to how the men were spared is the fourth person, the son of the gods, who walked among the flames. We should not assume that this fourth person was an Old Testament appearance of Jesus, although we cannot rule out that possibility. The description, son of the gods, excuse me, was given from the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar, not from one of the devout Jews. In Old Testament times, the phrase sons of God sometimes referred to people, but it also could refer to angels. Genesis chapter 6, verse 2 and verse 4, Job chapter 1, verse 6, and chapter 2, verse 1, and chapter 38, verse 7. This is the most probable reading of our verse. God may have sent an angel to comfort the three men or to provide a sign to the king and his counselors. Nebuchadnezzar certainly was convinced. He referred to the Jews as servants of the Most High God. This phrase culminated in a royal decree that protected those who worshiped Israel's God. Daniel chapter 3, verse 29. The point is clear. God is indeed the Most High God, and his will always prevails in the end. Those who worship him alone do so with this ultimate end in sight, regardless of short-term suffering. Thank you so very much for watching and listening. Join me soon for the next backstory and more. And remember, every Sunday at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, I release a new video for the upcoming Sunday school lesson. Stay safe and may God bless.